Hello! If you didn't know who this is Miss Parrish. Hi. I hope you guys have had a good weekend or are having a good weekend. So it's week 11 of class. Can you guys believe it? This class has flown by. I can't believe we're already on the third unit. So the reason why I've made this video is because of how MLA plays a part in the rest of this class. Papers 1 and 2 had the option to be a little more creative writing oriented, so we didn't mess too much with MLA, which is the Modern Language Association, or how we cite, because there was options for you not to have to use it. Well, now that we are in paper 3, which is about drama and is a bit of a more straightforward paper, whether you choose to analyze a play or do a compare and contrast out of it, we are going to start using MLA. And our research paper, which is the one after this, you definitely have to use MLA citations. So the reason I'm making this presentation is because I found in the past the law students just giving you the presentation isn't quite enough. And I completely understand that. So this video is to kind of not only go over MLA in-text citations and how it works, but also to help you find the sources that I'm looking for in your third and fourth papers. Because even though all of you have had 121 in order to get into this class, some of you may have had it 10 years ago, and MLA has changed a lot since then. Some of you may still be in high school, and MLA's even changed within the last few years. And some of you, maybe you're in high school and your high school doesn't really focus on MLA, and somehow you got past 121 and didn't really use it that much. In any case, this presentation and this video is to help you kind of understand what MLA is, why we use it, and also how to use it. So it's going to be in 2 parts, and this is part 1. So on your screen you guys see the presentation that I have here, MLA and sources, picking the right sources and using MLA. What MLA is it stands for the Modern Language Association. It's basically a bunch of English nerds who got together and said, this is how we're giving people credit for what they write. Because, I mean, look at your textbook. It's this huge document, and someone didn't just write that overnight. The 2 people, Ruth and, I think you pronounce it Giko, who worked on it, they spent probably years putting that book together. And so it would be awful as an author if you found out people were using your work and not giving you credit for it, right? So that's sort of how citations came about. Now, back when the Modern Language Association was founded and started using citations, it was mainly just books and newspapers that you could cite, so the formula was pretty simple. But now we can cite virtually everything. Literally, nearly any text or written word can be cited in MLA, which is awesome, but at the same time can be a little complicated. So we'll get more into that into part 2. But for this first part, I want to go over just some basics. So the main thing, and this kind of falls into paper 4 more than the current paper, is picking credible sources. And the reason why I put this on here is because we are saturated in our current culture with news, with media, with blogs, with videos. There's so much information out there that you want to make sure that your paper is being represented with the most accurate, up-to-date, and factual information possible. Now we'll get into that whole factual bit in a minute, but basically when you're choosing a source, you want it to be as unbiased as possible. Again, we'll get back into that in a second. You want it to be from a credible source, meaning is it from some Joe Schmo's Bigfoot blog that he put up last night, or does it look like an actual professional source someone took time to make? Personal testimonies are facts. Personal testimonies are stories that people tell, and you can cite those, or obviously facts. And then you want to make sure that your source is relevant or timely. If you're writing an analysis of the movie It that just came out, you don't want all of your sources to be from 1990 with the television series. That wouldn't mesh up well. It wouldn't be a good representation of the thing that you're analyzing. So, now here's the thing about bias with sources that I want to talk about, because this presentation, I use this in 121 and 122, and with 121, this is usually around the time we get to argument and persuasion. And in those types of papers, or a straightforward research paper, you don't really want bias. You want it to be factual, objective information. Here's the thing. We're in English 122. We're talking about literature. As you've probably seen with our chapters on poetry, especially, and fiction, there is bias with the author of literature. Literature is made with a theme, with a message, a purpose, and oftentimes that comes with an opinion. So when we review or analyze these pieces of literature, we are inserting our own opinions into that review. That's our critique. And if you cite sources that are reviewing pieces of literature, that is filled with their bias as well. The trick here is you want to be transparent. You want your audience to know if you are citing a biased source. You want your audience to know that you're not trying to deceive them, you're just presenting information you feel is important. So that's why I have this paragraph here that's an example, that you're acknowledging what is being said, but you realize that it's important to your argument and the point you're trying to make in your paper. So if you cite a blog or a video critique or review, I'm okay with that. Just make sure you make that clear when you cite that source and you use it in your paper. And here's the example. Even though they may be labeled as highly conservative, they make a valid point. So as long as you tie it back to your argument and you acknowledge that bias or that opinion and say, well, here's the reason I'm using it, you're fine. This paper is a little bit more lax on that than other papers that we use or do. Or other classes as well. You know, a government class, you probably don't want to have this same setup. All right, as far as credibility of sites go, when you're looking at a site, obviously you've probably heard the phrase, don't use Wikipedia. And the reason for that is wikis, Wikipedia, ask.com, WikiHows, Abouts, they're all editable. People can get on and edit the content of those sites. I famously tell my 121 students that my friend Jairus in college, when we were in college together, he went on Wikipedia and changed Frank Sinatra's page to say that he was his spiritual advisor. And now there are people on the internet that actually quote him and say that he is Frank Sinatra's spiritual advisor. It's all false. None of it's true. But that's the whole point of it. You don't know. Because these sites, since people can access them and edit them, you don't know if the information you're looking at is 100% accurate. So if I see any of these sites listed as sources in your paper, I'm not going to count them, and I'm probably going to call you out on them. So if you are somebody that likes visiting Wikipedia, I would recommend going to the bottom of the page and then just reading what sources that Wikipedia is citing, and cite those instead. Cut out the middleman. Go straight to the main point. As far as websites go, this is kind of a list of the most credible websites or the least credible to the most credible. So obviously a .com or a .net, they're commercial sites. Anybody can buy those domains and make their own website. Now there is an exception. Hospital sites, medical sites, the American Cancer Organization, which I think they use a .org, but those sites can use a .com and obviously they're still reliable. But if you see bigfootsarereal.com, you might be a little skeptical. .org, like I said, is more credible than a .com or a .net because it's an organization site. But again, an organization can buy that site. It's a little harder to get than a .com domain, but it's still possible. So you just have to use your best judgment. And a .edu and a .gov, I won't question those sites because a .edu, like SIC's site, we can't just post, oh, mermaids are real, we found a mermaid in SIC's lake. We can't post that. So they're typically factual. And some EDU sites, like for universities or colleges, may have articles about certain pieces of literature that their staff has written. So that might be something to look into. And then a .gov site is obviously credible, but again, may not be as helpful for this type of paper because .govs are usually just dry, factual information. So again, these are the questions that you should ask to determine credibility. Does your site have an author? Now, since these are research papers about literature, you probably are not going to be citing a medical site. Unless I did have a student last semester actually write about the movie Split. She talked about how M. Night Shyamalan's Split was kind of not decriminalizing nor discrediting, but stereotyping people who have schizophrenia or split personality disorder. And so she did have to cite some medical sites in her paper. And if you're going to do something like that, absolutely, you can use those sites. But anything else, you really need to find an author and make sure your website or source that you are citing has an author. If it doesn't, you might be wary of it. Again, there are exceptions, and you can always ask me about that just to be sure. Also, is your site advertising anything? A lot of sites, and you probably tell your parents and grandparents to stay away from these, will have pop-up ads and banners everywhere. You don't want to use those sites. They're probably not the most credible because they're trying to sell you stuff all the time and may have viruses embedded in them. Who knows? Hopefully not. And then finally, does your site look professional? Does the information show bias or objectivity? But again, we've talked about that. There's a little bit more leeway in this 122 paper for that. So, facts versus testimonies. Again, this is more geared towards 121, but it's basically saying there's a difference between you finding factual information, which is objective, versus a story or a critique or a review, which is more subjective and has more opinions to it. They shouldn't be treated the same way. And then ethos, logos, and pathos we talk about in 121. You're probably familiar with them. I look for all of these things in your research paper, paper 4. Are you being credible, which is ethos? Are you providing factual information, which is logos? And then the emotion and opinions are more of your pathos, like your emotional appeals. So I will look for these in your paper. Obviously, you don't have to label them or anything like that. But as I read your final papers, I will be looking to see if it creates a cohesive argument. And when you see the guidelines for paper 4, it'll make more sense. All right, and finally, Kairos, which I've talked about, is just making sure that your sources are timely. The typical rule of thumb with MLA is anything within 5 years. So believe it or not, 5 years is 2012. So anything from 2012 on is considered timely and kairotic. Anything past that, I would recommend just being background information. So like I said, if you were reviewing Stephen King's It, the new version versus the old version, you could cite something from the 90s because it's important to your argument. But all of your sources can't be from the 90s, nor should they. All right, so the next part of the presentation is going to be discussing how to cite an MLA, but just a rundown again, it is the Modern Language Association, and the idea is to give credit where credit is due. So there are 2 ways that we cite. Anytime that you use a source within a paper, you have to put what's called an in-text citation, meaning that you basically give a little short in parentheses blurb saying a piece of information from where that source came from. And then the one that people most commonly associate with MLA, you have your works cited page, which is at the very end of your document. And some of you used it for paper 2. You included a works cited page. You did awesome. Thank you. But that's pretty much what it is. Paper 3 and paper 4 will have that works cited page at the end of your paper, and then you should be referencing which sources you use where as you go. And that is your in-text citation. They're kind of like hyperlinks to your works cited page, only they're in physical form. All right. So I'm going to stop here, but we are going to go back to MLA to in-text citations in part 2. So stick around and check out part 2, please. And it should help you to better understand how to do in-text citations and MLA works cited page citations. All right, see you in part 2.